Hello everyone, I'm Ruth McKee, Project Director with the Hospitality and Tourism Skills Network, HATS for short, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar on training and development for your existing team as part of our Recruitment and Retention Webinar Series that's been brought to you by HATS and supported by Tourism NI. Staffing issues, as we know, continue to be a major concern for the sector, which is a core focus for the work of HATS, which is an employer-led network supported by Invest NI, and it brings employers from across the industry together with key stakeholders with a collective focus on addressing talent attraction and retention issues in the sector through collaboration. So as part of our activity, this webinar series has been delivered to help businesses in their efforts to recruit and retain a sustainable workforce. But it's also to support the adoption and implementation of our hospitality and tourism commitment, a voluntary code of conduct launched by HATS to improve the attractiveness of hospitality and tourism as a provider of good quality employment and a great place to work. The commitment covers critical areas such as providing good quality training, which we're going to focus on as part of this session, work-life balance, wider employee support, which the webinar series dives into in much more detail. So for this session, we're putting the spotlight on the area of training and development to highlight best practice in developing your people, multi-skilling your teams through the creation and management of relevant and engaging training and development plans. And I'm delighted to welcome Karen Healy from Meraki to deliver this session. Karen is a learning and development consultant specializing in the hospitality industry. She has 25 years combined experience in hotel operations and learning and development, which includes working with the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in America and closer to home, the Clontarf Hotel and the Conrad Dublin, as well as Hilton, which she headed up learning and development for their portfolio in Ireland. A real breadth of expertise there, Karen, that you bring to this session. And I'm delighted that you can join us, and I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Great, Roisin, thanks a million for a great introduction. I'm delighted this is recorded. When I'm having a bad day, I'll be able to look back on that. Thank you very much for having me on the webinar today. It's great to be part of such a fantastic initiative, and especially to be able to talk about an area within the hotel and tourism sector that I'm so passionate about, which is learning and development. First and foremost, I think Roisin really highlighted in the introduction there that the notion of learning and development within our sector has really only started coming to the forefront of recent times. And I think really to be able to highlight how important it is to mind the people that we have, but also from an employer branding point of view, to be able to attract new talent into the industry as well. And again, Roisin touched on it there in her introduction. We do have a role, every single one of us within the industry, to be able to raise, I guess, our perceptions of the industry and how we sell the industry to the outside world. We've maybe shot ourselves in the foot in the past, and I think it's a really great industry to work in. So I think collectively, we certainly have a responsibility to be able to promote the industry in a positive light moving forward. So to that end today, I'm going to look specifically at learning and development within the industry, but then I'm going to look at it from the guest journey, then from the team member journey, and also just to touch on culture within our individual organisations and why that's really important from a learning and development point of view. And lastly, I'm hopefully going to give you some really practical ways that you can make this happen within your individual organisations. So we all know from a learning and development point of view, what you give is what you get. So sometimes it's about the simple things like sitting with somebody in the canteen and being able to have a conversation with them and identify what they as an individual really enjoy about their role within your hotel or tourism organisation. And so to that end, I think it's important that we just bring this right back to basics and actually spend a bit of time with our team members. Later on in the presentation, I'm going to touch on appraisals. Some organisations call them performance development reviews. And I think they are underestimated as a management tool that can really assist us when we're looking at the individuals within our organisation. That's what's really going to make the overall team work, if we know what makes the individuals tick. Obviously, learning and development is hugely motivating for those that are interested in it. And at this point, I would really highlight there are some people in our hotels or tourism organisations that just want a job. And to be able to push them into various different learning and development solutions that really are for people who want a career can actually turn them off the role that they have. So the first thing that I would suggest for anyone watching this webinar today is really to sit down and identify who is there to do a job and to do it well, but they don't necessarily want progression, and who is there for the career and they do want progression. And I think there's a place for learning and development for both of those cohorts of people, but really then to consider what learning interventions work based on whether it's a job or a career for the individuals within your team. And that's what becomes motivating about learning and development, knowing what works for the individuals. One of the buzz phrases that's going on at the moment is the whole idea behind employer branding. And it really has become more important, as Roisin mentioned in the introduction. Staff shortages are something that we're all acutely aware of at the moment. We're all feeling the repercussions of that. And more we have to look at ourselves as a brand that we're going out to the marketplace with. Gone are the days where we used to interview people and they would have to sell themselves and what they could bring to our organisations. We now as an organisation have to be able to sell ourselves to potential team members and who come to interview with us. Obviously, learning and development is massively important for customer service. That old nut of our happy people lead to happy customers. And again, the way that we approach learning and development needs to be considered in order for that customer service and retention to work long term. And then lastly, one thing that I'm really happy about in our industry is that we've become much better at succession planning. This was probably a foreign concept to us a few years ago within the industry, but I think more and more we're realizing that we have to be able to sit down at regular intervals and take a look at our organizational chart, take a look at the key players within that organizational chart and be able to say, okay, if John leaves tomorrow morning, who is going to replace John? And how am I going to ensure that that person is well able to replace him and do that effectively and successfully? Or likewise, if John is promoted tomorrow morning, who then steps into that role? So for all of these reasons and so many more, I think training and development is something that each of us have a responsibility to do a deep dive into and really consider, okay, where am I at the moment and where do I need to be? And sometimes that can be really, really overwhelming. And I think hopefully as a result of today's webinar and some of those practical tools I'm going to share with you, it won't be so daunting to at least take the first step on the journey towards introducing it in a more solid and practical way within your organizations. Obviously, the guest journey is huge. We are all now part of a social media world where each of our customers are effectively a mystery customer. They come in and they have the opportunity then to go on to the likes of TripAdvisor, etc., and share with the world what they thought of our particular tourism organisation or our particular hotel. So really, we have to stop and consider the touch points within the guest journey and how each of our team members interact with customers. And I think that's a really good place to always start when we're looking at training and development. So even if you're completely lost and you're thinking, I've never done a training plan before, I have no idea how to go about this, literally sit down with your TripAdvisor feedback, and that will give you a really good indication of what needs immediate attention from a training and development point of view. So in order to create those memorable experiences and to ensure that all of that money that we spend on PR and sales and marketing isn't lost on a customer just coming to us once, that we have that repeat customer base coming back to us, it's important to be able to look at their feedback from a customer point of view and then apply that to our team member training. I think it's fair to say that, you know, customers don't necessarily come to our establishments to admire the carpet or to compliment our curtains. Yes, all of those things are important, but some of the organizations that I have worked in over the years, they have been in bad need of refurbishments. But actually, as an overall brand within maybe an international setting, they always did quite well against their peers in maybe Asia, etc., where they had beautiful products, but they always did better from a customer service point of view because they focused in on the guest feedback and they focused in on those interactions that their team members were having with the guests and based all of their training and development on that. The other side of it then is obviously our team members' journey. And like I mentioned at the outset, this has become really, really important for our industry. We know that we are short-staffed and we know that we have a responsibility to the people who currently work in the industry, but also to the people who we want to attract in the future. So how do we mind the people we have and how do we attract the people for the future of the industry as well? And really a lot of that comes back to looking at, do we do our learning and development journey well? Do we do things like induction when people come to join us, sorry. So if you consider way back when we started out in this industry, we would have had the experience where we would have gone into hotels or tourism organizations and they may not have been expecting us, that we might have been hired by one manager and then another manager was left responsible for us, but they didn't necessarily know that we were coming. They were up the walls really busy that particular day. And so it was kind of a baptism of fire. It was, sink or swim, thrown in the deep end. And we all just got on with that. But actually, at no point did we feel comfortable. No point did we feel confident that we were going to be able to deliver the service that was expected of us. So being able to learn from that experience from ourselves, it's really important to take that step back and think, okay, if I'm a new team member joining this organization or coming into this property tomorrow morning, what is the first impression that we want to give? We always consider the first impression that we give to the guest, and we need to apply that exact same principle to new team members that are coming in as well. So again, from a training and development point of view, consider what induction you have in place. Do you have somebody within the individual departments in your hotel that can look after somebody? You may have departmental trainers, for example, somebody who is dedicated to looking after new starters whenever they arrive. There's nothing worse than starting in food and beverage, for example, and not knowing where the teaspoons are. There's nothing worse than starting in accommodation and not knowing where the face cloths are. So all of those small things really add up to people feeling comfortable and confident from the get-go. And actually, there's a phenomenal amount of research that will give you unbelievable percentages when it comes down to it of people who are given induction training at the beginning of their employee journey and those that don't, and in terms of how long they stay within your organization. And it makes sense when you break it down. If I felt welcomed, if I've been given a tour of the building, if I know how to get to the staff canteen, if I know where the locker rooms are, if I know how to do the basics of my job and I know who to go to if I need any help, I'm going to be very comfortable in that environment and I'm going to stay a lot longer. There's also then the importance of making people feel that they have control over their own work interactions. So for example, if they do have an interaction with a customer, that they feel that they have a bit of autonomy over what they can do, especially if the customer hasn't had a good experience. So how do they do service recovery? How do they deal with a guest complaint? So moving on from induction training in the employee journey, they're naturally going to come across customers who aren't happy. And how do they then deal with that without feeling like a rabbit in the headlights? And I'm sure you've all been there, where you can appreciate that it is the first guest complaint you deal with is an awful one because you've never been in that situation before. So to be able to give them the tools to feel confident, how far can they go in a guest complaint or a service recovery situation? What can they do to appease the guest, to make sure that the guest is happy before they leave the building? And I think there's a massive opportunity for us there in terms of the autonomy that we give to new starters and the confidence that we give them to be able to deal with those situations. And then over and above that, various different times within the employee journey, there will be opportunities where they might flag to us that they would really like to do a particular course, or that maybe they've gotten a bad piece of customer feedback, and instead of taken that maybe as a disciplinary issue or something that we have to reprimand them on. If we just change our thinking slightly and think, okay, this is an opportunity for me to provide this particular team member with learning and development so that they can improve that skill set that they clearly aren't very good at the moment. In terms of service standards in particular, it is absolutely crucial that we get the learning and development piece right. I know for any operators that are watching this particular webinar, the mere mention of the acronym SOPs and you come out in a cold sweat. At the end of the day, we are operators. We are on the floor. We are delivering customer service the whole time, and we're making sure that the operation works well. The admin piece, sometimes we're not so good at, but I cannot highlight to you enough how important it is to have those standard operating procedures in place. Those SOPs are vital in order for our team members to understand what we expect from them. But most importantly, if we flip it over to the customer experience, they feel SOPs and the continuous training and development around those from a consistency point of view. So if we're trying to attract customers and we're trying to provide them with consistent standard, we have to be able to consistently do standard operating procedure training. That can be very daunting if you're part of a really busy operation. Even the thought of how do I update these SOPs on a regular basis if a new coffee machine is brought in, or how do I update it if a piece of customer feedback has come in and we've decided to change that particular procedure whenever I'm so busy in the operation. And that's where I'd say to you, you don't have to do it all. So when it comes to learning and development, employ the skills and the knowledge of the people around you. Team members, supervisors, and managers all need to be involved in the learning and development within any particular hotel or tourism organization. So what I'd say is consider who is good at what and allocate them to do that particular piece of training. So for example, years ago, I was doing some food and beverage training within the Conrad in Dublin. And although I'm well able to consume wine, I don't necessarily remember my wine training from university whenever I used to do it on a Friday morning. So there was a gentleman who worked in the food and beverage department. He was a team member level. He was ridiculously passionate about wine. He had the skill set, and actually he was perfect to be able to deliver that piece of training, because then he felt like his skills were being recognized and he felt valued within that particular department. So consider that whenever you're doing standards training, because I think then your team members feel that they're a part of it, and it's not just you the whole time, the same voice trying to get across that consistency and that level of standard that you want within the particular departments. The other thing I'd say to you is don't make it complicated. So choose one day a week where you can do 10-15 minutes training on the standards within your department, and base the standard that you're going to do the training on your TripAdvisor review for that week. Have a look at TripAdvisor, see what you've done really well as a department, see what you maybe need to improve upon, and that can drive then your learning and development for that particular week. Previously, when I worked in the Hilton Dublin Airport under the Hilton brand, the accommodation manager always did her SOP training on a Sunday morning. She had the most amount of her team in on a Sunday morning, and she was able to do it in the staff canteen. She kept it really simple, and as a result, the consistency within that department was second to none. And it's because she was committed to making sure that the standards were trained on a weekly basis and that she took it directly from the customer feedback so that it matched. So I guess if you're starting from scratch with this and you're thinking, okay, I want to put together a training and development plan, bring it right back to basics. Check your TripAdvisor, identify what the standard is, and then choose a time once a week that you know that you have the most amount of team members on board, and then get really smart with it. I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, Zoom still has a place. Even you watching this webinar today, we used to do this all the time during the lockdowns, and now we've moved out of that a bit. But even for your meetings, even for your standard operating procedures, go with a hybrid model. Yes, you can have people in person, but also then offer it that people can do it at home, because even the notion of having to get on the bus or get in the car and be able to get to the hotel or tourism organization that they're working in and then sit through a 10-15 minute training session, it's probably going to take them longer to get to the hotel and get home again than it is to do the training. So offer it in hybrid form, again, with no expectation that they have to be there, but you're more likely to be able to get them on board with training so that people can see you're serious about it as well. It also shows that you're very organized, and there's an element of trust that comes off the back of that for team members, because they see that you're serious about training and development. They trust you, that you're organized, and that you know what you're doing. I mentioned earlier the idea of culture, and if you really wanted to get in amongst learning and development in a serious way, I highly, highly recommend sitting down and considering, what are you all about? How are you going to do it? And what way do you want to do it? So we all have heard of vision, mission, and values, but that's all vision, mission, and values are. Your mission is what you want to be doing. Your vision is how you want to get there. And then the values are what you deem to be right within your particular property or organization. So get the foundations in place from a cultural point of view. And once you've got those vision, mission, and values, you can really start to build on the layers around learning and development. And that's what allows you then to drive the expectations of what you expect from your management team, but also what you expect then from your team members as well. And the customers will inevitably feel that. They'll feel that there's a bit of coherency that goes on amongst the team. A few weeks ago, I was over in Edinburgh, and we were kind of rushing to do Mary King's Close. I don't know if anyone has ever done that previously, and it's a great tourism experience if you're ever in that area. But we were kind of rushing, and we had 2 children with us, and we decided just to run into this restaurant, and it turned out to be a fish and chip restaurant. It was nothing fancy, but what they did really well. But what I noticed in amongst, as we were sitting waiting for food, there was an amazing atmosphere amongst the team. And that's absolutely driven by the culture that they've created within that particular restaurant. So, and how I felt that as a customer was, one of the team members, as she delivered food to the table, she accidentally tripped. And some of the food spilt over the table, and she was very apologetic, and she was lifting things away. And instantly the manager came over, very calmly said, "Oh, let me give you a hand there, picking up the, the chips or whatever." And he had a bit of banter with the customers. And so they were getting a really good vibe from him. There was no drama from them. The girl apologized again. He said, "Oh, really sorry about that. We'll sort it out." But it was very much a team effort. You could literally feel the culture within that restaurant. And then as he came back with the replacement meal, he pretended to trip, and he got a bit of a laugh out of the customers that were sitting at the table. And it was just brilliantly done. And you could also see a crossover between sections as well. So as people were really busy, other team members were falling in, even though it wasn't their section, to be able to help out. All of that type of thing was felt by me as the customer, but it absolutely was driven from their culture. At some point, somewhere within their values, somebody within that restaurant has said, teamwork is fundamental to what we do within this restaurant, and this is what it looks like in real life. And that's how it was felt from the customer. So I think if you really want to look at learning and development in a really serious way, your culture plays a huge role in that, because it opens out doors from a learning and development point of view that maybe don't exist at the minute, and it will really help your team to be a part of that overall journey that you're trying to go on as an organization. So why is learning and development so important? these are just some things that I would suggest that you consider if you don't already do it. You could already be doing these things, which is fantastic if you are. But as a management style, I cannot recommend enough considering coaching within your organization. Coaching as a culture provides a much different place to work. And from an employer branding point of view, you will naturally attract talent and high quality talent because people will want to come and work within your organization. If you are coaching your team and you're allowing them to think for themselves, instead of doing everything yourself as a manager, then it is a very different place to work. I then, as a team member, feel very differently because I am asked my opinion. I feel that I am valued and my thoughts and ideas are considered whenever we are maybe going through a change in the hotel or the tourism organization. So if you get the opportunity at all to consider coaching or to go on any sort of it can even be a short program that you decide to go on, I think from a learning and development point of view, it's a great way to get rid of the hierarchy that may exist in hotels. I think the flatter we can make our structures, the easier it is to tap into really good quality learning and development for our team. And then they feel a part of their own journey rather than waiting for you to maybe come up with ideas and suggestions. If we do learning and development successfully and we've trained our team successfully, delegation naturally becomes part of what we are as an organization. So we're able to delegate effectively and people will then feel that they are not just being told what to do, but they're being asked to complete a task. They're given some autonomy to complete that task. They're given some parameters to complete that task. And they feel then that they have owned that particular change, or maybe it's a project without you as a manager having had too much involvement in it. I mentioned at the outset as well about succession planning. It's brilliant if we can get to this point within our industry. It just means then that we're not left shook whenever somebody leaves or if somebody gets promoted, that we're left with this huge gap. Most organizations now within our sector have started considering that they sit down once every 6 months, 12 months, and can literally look at everybody within their organization at management and supervisory level and be able to say, right, okay, if John leaves, like I mentioned earlier as an example, who fills his role? It also means at team member level, we can start to consider learning and development in terms of maybe a supervisory skills course that they can go on. So when the time comes, if a supervisor is promoted or a supervisor leaves, that our team members have a plan as well. This naturally leads to lower turnover within our organizations. A lot of people won't come and tell us that they're thinking of leaving, or a lot of people won't tell us that they have applied for a role that would be a promotion in another organization, because that's not the culture that exists within our hotel or tourism organization. And so if we start to be more transparent with things like that, to say, look, I sit down with you, I do an appraisal or I do an informal chat at the canteen, and you tell me that you're really interested, you might be working in accommodation at the moment, but you've always wanted to maybe try finance or HR. Getting rid of that notion that it has to be linear. Most successful organizations now look at learning and development and understand that people don't move in a linear fashion within their careers anymore. People want to try different things. And gone are the days where if you work in an operational role, you stay in an operational role, or if you work in an admin role, you stay in an admin role. Years ago, when I was accommodation manager in the Hilton Heathrow in Terminal 4 in London, I remember thinking that was all I ever wanted to do. I absolutely loved working in accommodation. And then at one point, I remember getting involved in the inductions, the orientations within the hotel, and just loving the whole training piece. And then I thought, I really want to get into HR, but it just wasn't seen as it was this foreign thing, to the point as the manager, I didn't feel like I could say, I'd love to go and try HR. I'd love to even go and do 1 day cross exposure. We underestimate learning and development and cross exposure days. Like, they are where people get to dip their toes in the water. That allows them to say, actually, would I like this? Or that was just a notion, and actually I really wouldn't like to do that at all. I'm very happy where I am. We have to afford people those opportunities in terms of succession planning, where we do consider people for roles outside the departments that they're in already. And I think being able to sit and talk to people one-to-one, and for them to say, I've always wanted to dabble in X, that's where we will start to really enrich somebody's employment experience with us, because they'll have felt heard and they'll be able to try the things that they've always wanted to do. The other thing that training and development really does provide is that opportunity, especially at the moment. We've had a lot of people leave the industry. We've had a lot of people join the industry who have never been in our industry before. And we really have to be able to start to build our teams. So learning and development can allow people the opportunity to have the chats, to have a bit of fun. Sometimes we take it all way too seriously, and we're not performing brain surgery every day. So we definitely sometimes need to even out the employment experience and allow people to have a bit of fun at work as well. And I think that's where training and development really comes into its own. So it can be that, you know, you have a half day, theory session where people get to upskill, but then in the afternoon go away and do something fun, whether it's go-karting or bowling or whatever it might be. Learning and development in that morning piece allows people to share their opinions, and it allows people to see what other people are like and how they can align themselves to each other. So, for example, I did a management team build yesterday, and one of the questions that I posed was, and it's a team that has been through a huge amount of change. The company has grown massively in the last 12 months. So everybody has dabbled in lots of different areas of the business, but now it's time to align themselves again with their particular area of expertise or their discipline. And so the one question I asked at the start was, let everybody know what you do and what can they come to you for. So for the new team members that were in the room, or the new managers that were in the room, they were able to understand how everybody slotted into this huge organization. And that's where the team build is invaluable, because if you're doing it well, people can then start to identify those who are maybe good at skills that they're not good at. So that's another really important thing about learning and development, being able to say to people, you're not going to be brilliant at everything, but whatever you're not so good at, identify a person in the organization, perhaps through a team build, that is good at that, and build that relationship. And that's where the development really starts to come, because when back in the day when I was doing budgets, for example, it was never my strong suit. I always made best friends with the finance director in any organization that I worked in, because I knew that was a skill set I wasn't good at, but it was something that I could develop with the right person guiding me and supporting me at any one particular time. So again, that's another thing to consider in terms of learning and development. And the last thing I would say on this slide is choose the right training method for the right person. We tend to consider learning and development to be in a classroom, and it is 100% not that, which I'm not offended by, considering that's how I make a living. But what I'd say is consider the individual and their learning style. Some people are really creative and they don't do well sitting in a classroom. Some people love theory and they will sit all day in a lecture style setup and they'll be very happy and they'll retain lots of information. Be mindful that people learn differently. Be mindful that some people may even have learning difficulties like dyslexia that's unseen, and actually academia or that method of training isn't going to be ideal for them. So just to highlight this a wee bit further, this is effectively it's called the 70-20-10 model, and it's how we absorb learning and development. So it's actually quite scary to know that only 10% of how somebody learns is in a classroom, but we always place the most amount of importance on that style or method of training. 20% is learning through others, and 70% is learning through experience. So the 70% example I would give you is cross exposure. If somebody has kind of thrown it out there that they'd love to try another department or another skill set, they will learn 70% through doing that actual thing. And that learning could be that they love it, or that learning could be that they really don't like it. But either way, they're going to learn a lot from that particular experience. Personally, I learn a huge amount from other people. So my preferred method of learning would be that 20%. I could sit and have a coffee with somebody and I could learn so much more than if I was to sit and read a book on the same topic. So to that end, you may not even know what your team members' preferred learning style is, but just be mindful that one size doesn't fit all. So when you're considering any sort of learning intervention at all, you just need to go with a blended approach that offers various different ways of developing your people in a way that they're comfortable with. So for example, even if it's a book that you've read that you think is absolutely brilliant, but actually maybe some of your team members aren't into learning in that way, try and identify if there's an executive summary online that takes that book and puts it into a 5-6 page document that's much easier for somebody who's not into reading to learn from. The main thing I'd say to you is to consider doing some sort of performance appraisals with your team. Years ago, we used to have these books where we'd have to fill in pages and pages and pages of appraisals documentation for our team members. Thankfully, we've moved away from that now, and I think any appraisal or performance review that's any more than 2 pages with 1 page of a training plan at the back, it's probably too long if it's anything more than that. And the other thing about appraisals and why they have a bad reputation is people didn't understand why they were happening, and so they got afraid. They didn't know why they were going in to speak to the manager. So I think in order for it to land well within your organization and the culture that you're trying to create, just consider maybe sitting with your team members as a team initially and explaining to them what exactly an appraisal is. A lot of people have done them before, but you might have a new team member that has never done an appraisal before. So just consider that you have the opportunity to be able to tell everybody what an appraisal is to begin with, and then keep them short and sweet, keep them effective, but try and encourage your team members to be able to come to you with some learning and development suggestions as part of those appraisals. This, for me, I'm hoping is going to be one of the best takeaways that you'll get from this webinar today, and that is the various different types of learning and development solutions that are out there for anyone who's working in hotel or tourism. I mentioned cross exposure already. This is where your individual relationships with other managers or your peer group is really, really important. Traditionally in hotels, for example, cross exposure is really good between departments who naturally have a bit of a rub with each other. So things like front office and accommodation, food and beverage and kitchen. They're really good to do cross exposure because my job is always going to be harder than your job until you do my job. So even from a basic understanding point of view, if you want to develop your particular team, but they're always complaining about another department and what they're doing or what they're not doing, that cross exposure piece is brilliant in order for them to learn the challenges of that particular department. Cross exposure is also brilliant if your team member has flagged that they really want to try another department. Allow them to go 1 day a week. Allow them to go 1 day and dip their toe in the water. Allow them to go 1 day a week over 4 weeks. Whatever you decide and whatever you agree with the team member is completely up to you. And then you obviously agree it with the other manager as well, so that everybody knows what this is about, why you're doing it. Obviously, a lot of what I do is development courses. So this is things like train the trainer, supervisory skills. And although they're only 10% of how some people learn, they're actually brilliant to allow people to ask questions that they may not ask if they're in your particular property or organization. They're also brilliant for networking. They allow people to meet people from other organizations, other hotels, where they build up a network, and then they have somebody that they can even phone or send a direct message to be able to say, I'm in this situation, I've never been faced with this before, I'm just wondering, have you any experience with it that you could maybe guide me or give me some support in that particular area? That's learning, but they're doing it for themselves. They're not looking to you as their manager in order to identify what they can do. So there is certainly a place for those courses. And thankfully, we're getting back to in-person courses, which is brilliant. And even just on Tuesday, I did one, and it was brilliant to see afterwards the flurry of LinkedIn invites that I got. And that really showed that the people in the 5 or 6 different hotels that were partaking in the one kind of course, they all took that on board in terms of whenever I promoted the idea of networking, and that as a support from themselves, for themselves, and how they can develop themselves as well. You can also then tap into your suppliers. So start to look at how your suppliers, a lot of them have really big contracts with you, like your wine suppliers, your coffee trainers, even if you're in accommodation, it could be your laundry supplier. Start to look to them to see how can you align with them to see how they can maybe come in and do a bit of training within the organization. Or how you can maybe even go on site. So previously I've gone on site. There's a big linen company called King's Laundry, and they have a huge plant in Cork. And I have brought a group along to show what that operation was like, and it was just good for them to see what it's actually like on the other side, and why we always try to do reject linen, and why is that also important whenever it gets back to the laundry company. So again, for understanding, it's brilliant to start to get involved with your suppliers and see what they can do from a learning and development point of view for your particular organization. I mentioned there about visiting suppliers, but also consider going to your competitors. There is nothing like giving a team member £5 and being able to say to them, go way off there now and get yourself a cup of tea or coffee in that particular tourist attraction, or in that particular hotel, or in that particular restaurant or cafe, whatever it might be. The ability just to sit there, have a cup of tea or coffee, and observe what's going on around them, and be able to come back and give you some feedback. It's brilliant to identify what you're doing well, but also maybe what the competitor is doing better that you can learn from and maybe adapt for yourselves as well. So it's a win-win. It's a piece of learning in itself, but also it's a bit of variety for your team members, because they've gotten to go off site, they've got to see a competitor, what they're doing. And I think when you're in the bubble of your own organization or your own property, sometimes it's hard to see the wood for the trees. So by going and doing competitor visits, that as a learning technique is phenomenal in being able to bring your team members on and get them involved in what you're trying to do in terms of your own mission, vision and values. I mentioned executive summaries earlier. Most books, if you go on and you type into Google the book name and executive summary, most books have an executive summary online. So if people don't like to read, but you feel that there's something really valuable within that book that you want your team members, supervisors, managers to learn from, then executive summaries are certainly the way to go. Blogs are brilliant, as are podcasts, and I've included a few in the support document for this particular webinar today. And I think try and find, if you're trying to recommend them to your team members or supervisors or managers, find ones that aren't too long. So in particular, if you're looking to a podcast or a TED Talk, Try and find ones that are kind of 15, 20 minutes long. Anything longer than that, a lot of the time are time poor, and we just don't have the capacity to be able to listen or watch anything longer than that. Magazines, this is a really good one to consider getting into your team member canteens. So things like the hospitality magazines, have those in your canteen so that your team members can flick through them. And even if it's only to see a new wine glass that's being offered by some supplier in an advert somewhere, it just gives them an idea of what's going on in the industry. And it allows them then to really identify what they can maybe be doing differently. And it just gets them thinking a wee bit more creatively. It allows them to see maybe someone who's got a promotion within the industry and a bit of an article around them. It makes them more aware of what's going on. And that can only be a good thing in terms of their own development as well. Because it means when other people come in from other hotels, they have the ability to talk to them because they understand what's happening and they've seen various different happenings in the magazines. And lastly, from a learning and development point of view, I think consider any special projects for team members that are maybe a wee bit more creative, that they can get involved in. We don't have to do it all ourselves. And it's amazing learning for your team members to be involved in a special project. And predominantly that would be driven by change. So a lot of the time, if you're going through a refurbishment or if you're considering a new way of doing things, get your team members involved. Roisin mentioned at the start, I used to work in Clontarf Castle in Dublin. And I remember when we did the refurbishment there, and most of you will do this, but by bringing team members from other departments as well as accommodation in to see the bedrooms, for example, you'll get all sorts of weird and wacky where people will say, I don't like the headboard, or I don't like those red curtains, or whatever it might be. And that's all grand. But actually, you'll have a golden nugget in there somewhere. And I always remember in that particular instance, it was one of the accommodation assistants came in and the 2 drawers were attached to the headboard. And she had gone over and she said, it's so tight to the mattress that would be really difficult for me to get sheets down underneath the mattress when I'm changing the beds. And it was brilliant. It was something that we may not have considered as a management team, but that's where we can learn. So allow learning to be a two-way thing. And I think that's where special projects are brilliant, because you can learn just as much from your team members as they can learn from actually being in charge of a particular project. So just to give an overview of what we've covered today, and I've called it the important bits. So this is very much a summary for what you can consider as you move on from today's webinar. So consider that culture piece. As I mentioned, it's very much felt by your customers, even if you've never considered it that way. Just think of my example in that fish and chip restaurant in Edinburgh. I felt the culture that existed there, and that is no different for your customers whenever they come into your tourism organisation or into your particular hotel. Individual training plans for your team members are brilliant if you want to do it off the back of their appraisals, or if you call it performance reviews, either or. It just allows a team member who maybe does want a career in particular to consider that they have a journey to go on with you, and that they don't need to look to other hotels or tourism organisations in order to progress their career. The other thing that I would just mention in terms of team member training as well, even if people are just there for a job, there is still room for training and development for those people. So I used to have a team of 35 accommodation assistants. We ran at 120% occupancy in Hilton Heathrow and Terminal 4. It was just a cash cow. But we would have people come in, they'd sleep for 3 hours, we would turn the room, somebody else would come and stay in that room. So it was always full. And it actually made it really easy to run as a department, because we always knew that we were going to be full. So from ordering supplies right through to doing rotas, it was really, it ran like a well-oiled machine. But out of those 35 accommodation assistants, I would go so far as to say 100% of them just wanted a job. They wanted to come in every day, do the job and go home. And actually, there's nothing wrong with that. But if I start pushing any of them towards going on a training program or to maybe go and do a special project, they're going to be allergic to that. So from a training and development point of view, there was still an opportunity for me to do some sort of training and upskilling with them. So the example that I always give is when I was doing their appraisals, I would get them to do small things like I would teach them how to log into the computer and check for vacant dirty rooms themselves when they came down on their 10 o'clock break, instead of having to wait for their supervisor. So give them a bit of autonomy. It doesn't sound like a big deal to me and you logging onto a computer and checking for vacant dirty rooms. But for them, that was like climbing a mountain. They were not into technology. And so it allowed them then in a comfortable way to learn how to log in. And it left them then that they were much more efficient because they could get straight back up to the floors and get into the vacant dirty rooms. And they felt like they had a wee bit more control over their job instead of having to wait for the supervisor to come and go through them one by one and give them a list. So that's just something to consider as well in terms of those individual training plans. Job rotation, cross exposure, can't highlight it enough as a brilliant way of doing training and development. Allow people to taste other things. And then last but not least, consider how you make it happen. Don't make it out to be this big complicated thing. Allow people the opportunity once a week to come to the canteen and do 10 minutes refresher training, but do it on a consistent basis. Then people know that it's really, really important. Otherwise, things start to fall through the cracks and people don't think it's that big a deal. In terms of the supporting document that goes along with this webinar today, as I mentioned previously, I have put some suggestions in terms of other learning that you can do around this particular subject area of learning and development. So there's some podcasts on there, there is some TED Talks, etc. So just have a wee look at that because some of them are really quite good, especially talking about maybe the linear notion of learning and development and how we can maybe, you know, people want to go in different directions now and how we can facilitate that. I've also included a template for a career development plan, which I think might help even if you're not doing appraisals or you've never done performance reviews. It's just a one-pager that allows you to identify with your team member one-to-one, and it's a great tool to facilitate that conversation. So hopefully some of those supporting documents or that supporting document that I've put together will be of benefit to you. I wrap up today's session. This is my contact details. So if anyone has any specific information that they would like to get from me or anything that you've picked up in today's webinar that you would like to go into in more detail, I very much welcome that conversation. So please do get in touch, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all today.
Karen, thanks very much. Certainly your passion, not just for the industry, but for the subject of learning and development shines through very clearly in that presentation. Certainly one that's packed full of advice, practical tips for employers to be able to support their learning and development practices. I know you've noted there that you've obviously included some templates in your presentation, and we'll make those available to those attending the webinar as a follow-on. Certainly there are lots of takeaways from the presentation for those that are watching, but for me, I suppose a key takeaway is that a focus on quality learning and development in the business is an absolute must, and an absolute must that can positively impact employee development, productivity, retention, attraction of talent in terms of building the employer brand, but ultimately the guest experience and profit. So the focus on training and development, it's from my perspective, it's a no-brainer. Certainly as well, just as the industry looks to recover from the pandemic, we've got a real unique opportunity to reset the status quo when it comes to skills and professional development and how we're perceived as a sector. Being seen as an employer and sector that is committed to providing good quality training and development helps us to change the narrative and boost perceptions of our industry and build more employers of choice, all of which impacts on our ability to attract and to retain. So, Karen, thank you again for a very insightful and passionate presentation full of lots of tips and advice. Just in bringing the session to the close, I'd like to thank Tourism NI for supporting us to deliver this webinar series, and to all of you, thank you for attending. I hope that you have gained value and great insight from the webinar, and that you'll join us for some of the others that are following up in the series, for which you'll find details on the HATS webpage, hatsnetwork.co.uk. So it just remains for me to say we look forward to you joining us again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.